Welcome to In This Body, a podcast where we dive deep into the potent power of embodiment. I'm your host, Ailey Jolie, a psychotherapist deeply passionate about living life fully from the wisdom within your very own body. The podcast In This Body is a love letter to embodiment, a podcast dedicated to asking important questions like, how does connecting to your body change your life? How does connecting to your body enhance your capacity to love more deeply and live more authentically? And how can collective embodiment alter the course of our shared world? Join me for consciously curated conversations with leading experts. Each episode is intended to support you in reconnecting to your very own body. This podcast will be available for free wherever you get your podcasts, making it easy for you to stay connected to In This Body, the podcast with me, Ailey Jolie. Welcome back to In This Body. Today, I'm honored to sit down with a guest whose work I've long admired. Kristen Portney is a therapist who brings unique depth and richness to the field of reproductive mental health. Kristen's approach to therapy is rooted in the desire to bridge polarities and explore the nuances of human experience. She is deeply inspired by storytelling, meaning-making, ritual, and self-compassion, drawing from her own journey in therapy that began at a young age. Kristen's work delves into the themes of forgiveness, truth, self-love, and the liminal spaces we often find ourselves in, whether it's navigating an unexpected pregnancy, abortion, or miscarriage. Today, we'll be exploring the intersections of reproductive mental health and embodiment. We'll also touch on how the current political landscape surrounding women's reproductive rights is impacting these experiences, changing the way women feel about and connect with their bodies. Kristen, I'm so excited to have you here to share your insights with our audience. Welcome to In This Body, the podcast with me, Ailey Jolie. So the first question that I have for you today is a question that I have started asking each and every guest that I get the pleasure of spending time with. And this is the question of, what does being in your body mean to you?
Yeah, it's been a fun question to kind of roll over since I read it. And actually, I had a friend who was talking about embodiment, and she said for her that embodiment is about not abandoning herself. And when I heard that, I felt a full body yes, especially as someone who has a long history of doing that. And when I'm in my body, when I sense that I'm in my body, I'm listening, I'm asking myself questions, and I'm being responsive. Being in my body, being with my body means being my friend. And that's been a long journey to get to that point. And it means being honest and patient and truthful and adoring with myself. And then this morning I thought, actually, there was a lot of kind of like expectations or ideas about what embodiment, what I should say about it or what it is. And then I really felt, yeah, it is this place where I don't necessarily expect anything from myself. And a little kind of story about, the different practices I do to be in my body. Some are physical, some are more energetic, but I felt them come together a couple months ago where I had these new shoes on and I live on top of this big hill and I was walking down the hill and the shoes were really slippery and I slipped and I fell into a split. And this moment of getting up and noticing that I was okay, both that like I didn't lose my ground because I fell, and also like I was a little bit hurt, I had a skinned knee, but that my body could respond and be flexible. And I felt like that was a moment where I felt really embodied.
I love that. I love that your example is outside of the expected in some ways and like brings in those moments of like the intelligence of the body and that it knows what to do and knows how to respond to what we need.
Yeah, exactly.
My next question for you, and you gave a few little tidbits of what might be a part of this story in the last answer. I would love to hear what led you to your work in mental health, but specifically the strong focus you have on reproductive mental health. If you could share with the listener what you do today and what led you there.
Sure. Well, the first part of what led me to become a therapist is actually my beloved grandmother. She's
Mm,
a psychologist and introduced me to psychology and therapy and depth psychology. So I feel a little bit like a legacy going
mm,
to becoming a therapist. And when I started my graduate program at the California Institute of Integral Studies, just 2 months prior, I'd had my second abortion and was really floored by that experience. It was not what I was prepared for, what I had experienced in my first abortion. And that became just a deep inquiry while I
mm,
was doing my education and going into my first experience of being a clinician. At the time, I didn't know the term reproductive mental health.
mm,
And gosh, I think like Instagram was just emerging. So there wasn't this kind of like way of connecting and hearing stories at the time, or even the way that
mm,
Instagram was being used. And so I felt very isolated in that experience. And I knew that I didn't want other people
mm,
to feel isolated in their abortion experience. That has been kind of actually like a slow weaving into my clinical practice. I was leading post-abortion groups at women's gatherings in California or in Oregon on the West Coast, while I was doing yeah, clinical work in other areas in community mental health and building up my clinical skills there. All the while, abortion storytelling has always been a part of my work. And so in the Bay Area, I was connected with the Bay Area Doula Project, and I would, I don't know, maybe once a year for a few years go and share about my abortion stories. And as I continued to have more abortions and really step into the identity of someone who has had multiple abortions, that became kind of the central focus of my work, understanding abortion and recognizing the way that people who are having multiple abortions get overlooked or stigmatized, even within the pro-choice community.
mhm,
So now that I'm in my private practice, I am working with women and people who are in various stages after their abortion. Some people really just looking for kind of like quick validation. It's more short-term therapy. They just want to check out and make sure that what they're experiencing is normal. And once they kind of
mhm.
hear that validation, they're like, okay, cool, like that that feels good. And I feel ready to kind of walk now. Like I
Yeah.
can walk forward from that. And then for other people, having much more complex
Mm,
emotional and physical, uh, spiritual and heart experience after their abortion.
mm. My next question for you is because being in the field of reproductive mental health in the ways that I am, I know that embodiment and somatics is not often woven into the conversation. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on as a guest, because it is in how you present the language. It's right there, kind of explicitly, in how you present yourself. And I'm curious to hear from you what led you to merge those two things together. If it
Mhm.
was oh my goodness, I'm noticing a giant gap, or if it felt more intuitive, like just what you needed.
Mhm. I think now looking back, I can see the gap. I still see the gap. And I think it was more of an intuitive process. And I think I've come to feel and understand that listening is a really deep and embodied practice. And doing that as a therapist with other people, but also what that meant and what that means now for me to listen to myself, and that it actually takes all of me. And I know that
Mm,
you are a focusing practitioner, and so am
mhm.
I. So that just want to mention that as
Yeah.
also feels like a very deep embodiment practice of how to listen. But I started to, when I was listening to people having abortions and struggling after their abortion, what I was hearing was a fear or regret that they hadn't fully checked in with their full selves, or
Mm,
that maybe they heard their heart say something or their gut say something, but because of time, because of the pressure, maybe even the trauma of an unexpected pregnancy, they couldn't give themselves that time to listen. And so what I feel often that people are reconciling with after abortion is this sense of like, I didn't have the opportunity to really hear myself.
Mm.
And maybe a question comes up of like, would I have made a different decision? But it's almost more of just this loss of being able to really tune in to the
Mhm.
body or even to the pregnancy. People having abortions don't always really even get to identify as having been a pregnant person
Mhm.
and share what their experience was like of being 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 12 weeks, whatever it might be, pregnant. And so there's a loss there as well. They don't get to share what that felt like for them. Um, and so that led me into thinking about how to almost like listen backwards
Mm.
and that we can listen backwards and give voice to the heart, to the doubts, to the gut, to the mind, to whatever else was going on during the decision-making process, and give it the space that it needs to kind of bring something into like its fullness and wholeness of the decision-making process so that it can actually, so that the decision-making process can rest.
Mhm.
Because people, even after their abortion, are oftentimes still stuck
Mhm.
making they're still making the decision, even though the decision has been made. And so I found that this has really helped, yeah, kind of give some resolve in that area. And then zooming out from one-on-one work, I mean, in the landscape of reproductive health in general, it's a very heady conversation.
Mhm.
It's a conflict. And oftentimes it's like people aren't speaking from having the experience of being a
Yeah.
pregnant person and needing to make a decision to terminate a pregnancy on either side.
Mhm.
Um, and that's okay because we need advocates, you know, in the pro-choice uh, camp. And oftentimes just the curiosity is really missing of what it's like to be someone
Mhm.
having an abortion. So yeah, I feel that embodiment is absolutely needed. I see that people are operating from extreme burnout. They're leaving themselves in order to be able to do the work because of the climate that
Mhm.
abortion is in. At least I'll speak from the United States and how under attack people feel. And so oftentimes people are operating from fight or flight, or they're feeling shut down. And that's the only way that they know how to move forward and to operate from that
Mhm.
space. Um, and then on like this very basic level, and it sounds even funny to say it, but I mean, pregnancy is an embodied experience. And it doesn't mean that you're in your body when
Mhm.
you are pregnant or when you even give birth, um, and whatnot, but it's very striking. And so it's funny a little bit, like when we talk about pregnancy or talk about abortion, that the body isn't central to that
Mhm.
conversation, actually. Yeah.
It's always struck me as quite peculiar that it isn't. And I know that it comes from my own bias and lived experience. So when I was 16, I experienced a sexual assault
Mhm.
that I have no conscious memory of because of the physical injury of
Yeah.
what happened. But I ended up conceiving, so I was pregnant
Oh.
and I had a pregnancy loss that was quite traumatic. Tried to seek abortion, couldn't get abortion in where I was living at that time. But I deeply remember the feeling of my daughter in my womb. And
Yeah.
that for me was my cue of like, there's a whole felt sense, lived experience that
Mhm.
due to the trauma that I'd already endured before that moment, I had no connection to my body, but I had connection to hers. And it
Mhm.
became this thread of then curiosity that led me to all of the work that I do today. And so for me, then training as a clinician, I was always so perplexed. I was like, how is reproductive mental health not held with the most esteemed bubble around embodiment and the connection of embodiment? And why is this conversation around disconnection or disembodiment in this spirit
Mhm.
experience kind of not brought up or brought forward as mental health clinicians? And you spoke to something, and I would love to just even start here, like at the beginning of the experience, around the
Mhm.
trauma of unexpected pregnancy. And if you could speak to that experience with a little bit of a lens of embodiment or disembodiment.
Mhm. I mean, first, just thank you for sharing. I had chills.
Mm.
And I hate that that happened to you. And there's something like hearing that your abortion was also a portal into
Mm.
this work. It resonates so deeply with me. And of course, I'm not happy to hear that you were assaulted, but I am like happy to receive your story. It feels, yeah, it touches me
Mhm.
really.
Yeah, it's still one of the most yeah, it was like a portal. Like my life definitely changed in that moment, and I have no idea in what other way, if anything, could have connected me to my body in such a way where I woke up
Yeah.
to the reality of so much of life that I was missing than that experience. I don't
Mhm.
know if anything else could have done that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I do understand that. Um, and so your question on the trauma of an unexpected pregnancy
Mhm.
and embodiment and disembodiment. I mean, an unexpected pregnancy, I'll speak from my personal experience first, has felt like an emergency
Mhm.
and felt like I was out of control. I felt betrayed by my body. And in the beginning of my experiences, that I didn't really understand why I felt such intrusion uh, in my body. And so when I talk about the trauma of an unexpected pregnancy, I think that an unexpected pregnancy, regardless of anyone's trauma history, can feel, I mean, like like talk
Right.
about getting out of your baseline and just being in fight or flight for weeks and,
Mhm.
for weeks, maybe even longer. Um, and then for people who do have a trauma history, maybe there's been an assault or boundaries have been crossed at any point in their life, like it can really evoke that.
Mhm.
And so after my first, yeah, after my second abortion, which was my most challenging abortion, I felt this severe sense of being intruded upon and like
Mhm.
something terrible was happening to me. And this was before I started studying trauma or psychology, but at the same time, actually, my sister was pregnant with her first child. And I was very curious about pregnancy then because I was like, oh, wow, my sister's pregnant and I was just pregnant. And so I started reading about the psychology of pregnancy and came across literature on women re-experiencing trauma during birth and signs of someone going through trauma at birth. And I thought, wow, like that is also happening during an abortion that was happening during
Yeah.
my abortion. I haven't heard it applied to that language, but I know that to be true now. So learning
Mhm.
about trauma and pregnancy and birth was really a doorway into understanding my own experience of, but yeah, re-experiencing my own trauma history. But then separate from that, just the complete and utter overwhelm and discomfort and just disbelief of being pregnant when I didn't want to be pregnant.
Mhm. For someone who maybe is a little bit curious or resonates with what you said about the experience of any form of pregnancy loss, let that be miscarriage, abortion, stillbirth,
Mhm.
kind of activating the trauma vortex, I'll throw that word in there.
Yeah.
What would that look like? I know that definitely resonates with my experience. I've had several miscarriages due to some medical trauma that results from the experience when I was 16. And I know every time it was like this young part of me that was 16 just totally got activated, hijacked my brain. And I was like, woof, I'm like reliving this thing from years ago that
Yeah.
somehow each time is like was laying dormant and then just got poked. And I would love to hear from you. Um, what some of the signs might that be, how you support someone through that experience, how you even make sense of it, any of those questions.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, what you just touched on of like the younger self kind of taking
Mhm.
over, that's something that I absolutely see. And I'm thinking of one person that I worked with, which that was kind of the way that we got to understand what was happening, like what attachment trauma was actually being evoked
Mm,
through this experience of being pregnant and then no longer pregnant. And this was, so there's, I mean, the direct experience, like the physical experience, which can trigger the trauma vortex. And I mean, and that can look like hypervigilance, that can look like really shutting down, um, talking really quickly, people reporting that they feel numb or disconnected or like they don't know what happened to them, people kind of almost having an issue with remembering
mm,
how they got to where they were with the abortion. And to me, that's kind of a sign of, okay, like there's, I think we're starting to touch on some trauma.
mhm,
And then there's the relational trauma that can happen in an abortion, which is I might not be, having my own personal trauma history evoked in my body because of the sensations from pregnancy, but me and my partner do not want the same thing. And
mhm,
we're having to make that decision together. And maybe I'm making a decision based on what my partner wants.
mhm,
And is this person showing up for me? Is this person
yeah,
here the way that I need them to be here? And so I would say often there's a relational trauma that's
mhm,
being evoked, an attachment, oh my God, memories from their childhood, whether it's with their mom, with their whatever caregiver brought them up, but feeling abandoned
mhm,
or feeling like they had to cross their own boundary for the other person. Even if
mhm,
that decision, even if it's in the moment was okay, right? Like they can understand, like my partner's not ready to be a parent, and I can understand that. And I want to be aligned with them, or I want to become a parent with someone who actually wants to become a parent with me. And so I'm going to make the decision to terminate.
mhm.
And so that's absolutely fine and a really perfectly acceptable reason to terminate a pregnancy. And it's, oh my gosh, extremely triggering. And I think
Why do you,
that surprises people afterwards.
why do you feel like the relational aspect often gets missed? Because it's so self-evident and yet it's not spoken about, or I haven't heard it spoken about very often.
Yeah. It completely gets missed, and I think it gets missed under the very understandable kind of like campaign of my body, my choice,
Mm,
which I write about that of like yes and
mhm,
because most of the people who I'm working with after their abortion and in my own experience with abortion made this decision together,
mhm,
someone else. And oftentimes have made the decision because their partner wasn't ready, and not because they were I mean, that happens to people being coerced or, forced
yeah.
into having a baby or not having a baby. But just even talking about people who were in partnership with someone and they made a collective decision based on their partner not being ready.
Mhm,
And this gets missed because in the end, the person or the woman is still walking in and having the termination. So it still feels like they could make a different decision. And that is false. And that if people are making the decision to have an abortion together, they must both carry that weight together. And this is where there is really no storytelling that I'm aware of or literature that I'm aware of the partner of someone who's pregnant coming forward and saying, I'm taking responsibility for having an abortion or
mhm.
even identifying as having an abortion.
It's been one thing that has always kind of shocked me about my male friendships, and I've been deeply curious about it, is a lot of those men, I've been the first person they told about the experience of having an abortion. And I've always been like, okay, what kind of woo-woo vortex is going on? Because I don't speak about my reproductive health, my
Mhm.
history, the challenges I've had, what that's looked like. And yet there's some safety that these men have felt to share with me. And it's also been very heartbreaking to hear the amount of men who have this story and don't know what to do with it, because there is this strong feminist, my body, my choice.
Mhm.
But the and that you just beautifully brought in often gets missed. And then the consequences of that, we don't really acknowledge or even speak of. Um, are there any other consequences that you see of the kind of strong my body, my choice stance, which is so important and also doesn't bring in the relational component as we're discussing?
Yeah. I mean, I think that it misses a lot of people who would have loved to become a mother or become a parent,
Mm.
um, but didn't because not only relational issues, but zooming out of just realizing financial issues
Yeah.
or familial history or medical history. Like there's so many things that go into the decision to actually become a parent,
Mhm.
and that the my body, my choice, although like is true
Mhm.
and important, it also misses the people who are like, wouldn't have chosen that if I would have had more support to parent. And And so, I mean, that touches on, kind of the organization Sister Song and
Mm.
who founded the term reproductive justice, which is like, if we're talking about abortion and people being able to access abortion, we're also talking about people being able to become parents and, raise their children in environments that are safe and free from harm, especially children of color growing up. So, yeah, the loss of being able to become a parent in a culture that doesn't actually support people who are, I mean, at least in the US now, even middle class people are struggling to afford
Mhm.
being parents. And so anything middle class and lower is just like a real challenging decision of, can we take the burden, the financial burden, whatever it might be, the caretaking burden of actually having children, even if we would really like to.
I really appreciate your capacity to zoom out and see systemic lenses. It's always something that I really adore in a clinician when you see your client and then you can kind of zoom out. And it also feels specifically in this realm of reproductive mental health so essential to see the system in which is enacting on the individual. I would love to bring us back because I want to hear more from you. If someone has had a challenging abortion, what are some examples of what that might feel like or look like? Acknowledging not everyone does. I've had those clients, they've been in
Mhm.
my office. It's just, it wasn't for them, and that's
Yep.
wonderful.
Yep.
But for those that maybe have, or I've had clients who like the abortion they had 20 years ago, all of a sudden is haunting them in their nightmares, and they're like, don't know what that's about. Um, yeah, some examples from you.
Mhm. Yeah, so what it can look like or feel like or present like is that there's a preoccupation, being very
Mm.
preoccupied with the abortion, with the decision-making process, combing over every single detail about how they got to where they were, which is no longer pregnant. And so whether that's really 1 week after the termination or it's a few months or a few years down the line, although I'll say that presence, that when I'm catching that in my office with people, that's usually in the year or two after abortion. I hear that most. And so people feel anxious. They can't keep their mind off of the abortion. They're feeling a sense of loss and dread, a lot of confusion because they identify as pro-choice and they're having an experience that makes them feel afraid of like, am I suddenly what does this mean about who I am? And so there's this like questioning their identity, even
Mm.
around their identity politics, and um, a lot of like tearfulness and crying, talking about having conflict in their relationships, their partner, um, feeling disconnected from themselves. So that's
Mm.
mostly what I'm seeing, people kind of coming in and being like, I don't know what to do. I
Mhm.
don't really know what's happening.
How do you often support someone who is coming in that way?
Mhm. I mean, first, just really validating that this is a common experience that I encounter.
Mhm.
I know it may not be the most common experience in the abortion world, but that I've seen this a lot. I've met this story. Of course, it's not the same, but I've heard something like this before. I've experienced it myself. I also share in whatever ways appropriate, my own history with abortion because I feel like it adds a sense of safety to like, I'm here too with you. Um, and And at first, just really, really listening to them tell the whole story and oftentimes listening many, many times to the story over and over again, and very simply finding anchors in the story of like, this is an area where I hear you really trusted yourself,
Mm-hmm.
or that you felt like you were validating your own choice that you were making. So just a lot of reflecting um, and validating. My gosh, just, I mean, I can't underestimate how important just telling someone like that's okay. And I hear how complicated this was, and that you're here and you've made the decision, and also helping to ground people in the present moment of making some distance from the decision-making process. Like you're here now, like you can rest a little bit. Um, and kind of helping people identify that has been a really big deal, actually, of like, whoa, I didn't even realize I was still making the decision.
Mm. Yeah.
Yeah.
What I'm hearing even there ties into the next question I was going to ask you, but it's kind of that present centered or focusing oriented, kind of
Mhm.
in the body's quasi embodiment based language or somatic languaging. When you have someone who comes in and they've had the experience of abortion, acknowledging it is often wrapped in moral and socio-political stuff, we'll just call it. How do you support someone in starting to move it into an embodied experience or just in an embodied framework, if we just even keep it in theory land?
Mhm. Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, sometimes it can be quite challenging to move from the moral, the stigmatization, the like the outside voices that are telling someone who they are.
Mm-hmm.
And my my way into talking about embodiment are questions around what is it like for you to forgive yourself,
Mm-hmm.
and what's your relationship? What does self-compassion mean to you? Do you know what does it feel like when you are feeling compassionate with yourself or with others? What does trust feel like? Do you trust yourself? And often those questions will break away from this like storm outside of like, am I good? Am I bad? Am I good? Am I bad? And will bring it into their, yeah, oftentimes more of their felt sense of I know or I don't know what it feels like to trust myself or to forgive myself, or what my own, I have an idea of what self-care is, but I'm actually just regurgitating something I heard and I don't know what that feels like. And so that becomes this whole other conversation, which may touch on abortion, which is
Mm-hmm.
what where the conversation began, or not. It might take us somewhere completely different. And I always want to um, kind of like have a caveat when I talk about self-forgiveness and abortion, because it's not that I think people need to forgive themselves for having an abortion, but what I often see is that people somewhere along the line are beating themselves up for something,
Mm-hmm.
whether it was I shouldn't have listened to my partner, or I should have maybe reached out to other friends and talked to them first, or maybe I should have waited a week, or maybe I should have listened to my gut. And that this is where self-forgiveness comes in. Like, can I forgive myself for being where I was at the time of
Yeah.
my abortion? And that I didn't have the capacity to check in this way. This is something I've learned 2 years after, and maybe and would be able to use now, but I couldn't use then. And
Mm-hmm.
so this is really important, of being able to help people really um, almost like crystallize where they were where when they made the decision to have an abortion. And that the abortion story evolves and changes over time, but actually where you were at that time, what you knew, what you saw, who was supporting you, who was the president, like whatever it was, is just like true of that time. And we can't apply where you are 2 years ago to where you were then. And actually, that's something that's really um, almost cruel to do.
Mm-hmm.
So can you really just see yourself and honor yourself for where you were at that moment?
Mm-hmm. I know the self forgiveness piece for me was actually like a year, 2 years before those experiences. And mine was a pattern of having unprotected sex because of this medical trauma and then getting pregnant, having miscarriage after miscarriage after miscarriage. And for me, it was this place of just deep forgiveness of like, I kept, or what I had so much self hatred for was that I was choosing men who I knew wouldn't be there for me. And so
Yeah.
it wasn't even about the pregnancy loss or the trauma of that, but like not listening to my gut that this person was using me for my body or didn't have my best interests at heart. And that we were running a risk that I actually knew that they couldn't hold me to because I had assessed their capacity. And it was very interesting because it felt like I should have all of this like stuff I should feel about a miscarriage and pregnancy loss, but it was like, oh no, it was actually way before then around the relational decisions. That's where the wound of self-forgiveness was for me.
Mhm.
I love what you said. How do you support someone in kind of pulling that apart? Because there is so much stigmatization and so much socialization and so much isolation. And I'll use the broader term now, any form of pregnancy loss, to find that moment of like, where do we actually need to go back and just have like the yummiest, warmest blanket of self-compassion for you?
Mhm. I mean, I think it starts with, working with someone and hearing their story and just where I feel my own natural, like, oh, like like what you just shared, just like I feel so touched and like you're so tender and just want to, yeah, just like I'm in my heart listening to you right now. And those moments being kind of like touchstones of like where my compassion is really clear and I
Mhm.
can share it very openly and genuinely. And then um, inviting people in to that place with me.
Mhm.
Can you see, can you feel like what you went through? Oh my gosh, like this is such a huge part of your story and it's so unfair. And I'm so sorry you had to be there. And just really slowing down and sharing my own compassion. And oftentimes that is something that really needs to be repeated over and over and over for some people. And until like really, I mean, maybe this goes into a little bit of narrative therapy also of how they can tell their story with an air of compassion themselves and seeing like, oh yeah, I did my best at that point in time. And just being there as a therapist, like, yeah, yeah. And then sometimes the awe is more like a hell yeah, like holy shit. Like this is, I don't know, putting the right emphasis and exclamation
Mhm.
on different parts of the story, that not everything is this like, whatever like, because some people are really triggered by self-compassion. They're like,
Yeah.
whatever. What does that mean? It's, I don't want to just like take a bath or do this, tell myself that I love myself or call myself honey and being like,
Mhm.
well, actually, self-compassion is saying sometimes like using the word fuck and saying like fuck
Yeah.
yeah to myself
Mhm.
or like I just see myself and I know that that's true and that you validating your own experience is one of the most compassionate things that you can do.
Mhm.
And so I think finding like it's so different for everyone because some people are really the kind of like sweet, cozy kind of self-compassion people. And then some people are, I don't know, like more metal or something in their
Yeah.
experience of self-compassion and being like, that is self-compassion. Like that's your
Totally.
self-compassion.
Mhm.
It doesn't have to be like, pink and bubble bath
Fuzzy.
or like whatever
Yeah,
like
yeah.
image like comes up. People are like, oh, that doesn't resonate with me. It's like, okay, well, what's yours?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that you brought in the other more metal based self-compassion that's a little bit hard. I have like various parts that like different forms of self-compassion. So,
Yeah.
and I also love that you spoke to using your body as kind of the inflection point for people of like when you feel that tenderness inside yourself being potentially the first mirroring or barometer of like, ooh, this is like where we really need to lean in. This part is needs some support or needs some holding or needs some curiosity because there's something here. Um, my next question for you, and we haven't gotten into it, but I would just love to even just spend a little bit of time here, is pulling apart the differences between abortion and miscarriage from an embodied perspective, because the two terms, we often pregnancy loss kind of gets the umbrella over them for lots
Mhm.
of different reasons. But since I have you and you have such expertise in this area, I would love to hear the differences from your perspective.
Yeah, sure. First, I go to my own experience of someone having multiple abortions and feeling like guilty or maybe ashamed or like feeling the unfairness of life when I have my fertility and someone else is struggling to get
Mm,
pregnant or to carry a pregnancy to term. And the first time I did an abortion support group, a few women showed up who had had miscarriages.
mm,
And they were like, "Can I come to this workshop?" And I was kind of like, "Oh, yeah,
mhm,
like okay, like you sure, be here." And feeling for the first, seeing and hearing for the first time of that there is so much space for these two different
mhm,
parts of pregnancy loss to be together and how they can actually be resources
mhm,
for each other. And that was a really surprising moment for me. And I think I really went into like the joy of the umbrella term of pregnancy
mhm,
loss and being like, oh, we're here together. And we're actually not as siloed as I thought that we
mhm,
were. And I mean, the experience is different. The intention or the desire or the heart's yearning may be completely different. So the sense of loss um, is felt on a different level. Although, I mean, people who have an abortion also can experience loss as well. I think now it's, interesting as, you know, the laws in the US are changing and making it almost criminal for people, making it criminal for people to have an abortion and a miscarriage, and seeing that like the medical physical side is so similar
mhm,
that we can't really even differentiate the two. So, which opens pregnant people up to so much danger in the
mhm,
US, different parts of the US right now. And and then thinking about embodiment after a miscarriage or after an abortion, I think it really depends on how you carry your story and
mhm,
what the story is. And both have a similar quality, but different of something's wrong with me.
mhm,
Whether it's because like my body can't or won't carry this pregnancy, or there's something wrong with me because I chose to let go of this pregnancy. Um, And so there's so many parallels and so many similarities, and there's just a lot of nuance.
mhm,
And I think nuance for me is just like my best friend in this work.
mhm,
If we're not in the nuance of pregnancy loss within what people experience in their miscarriages and what people experience in their abortions, then we're missing.
mhm,
And so how to kind of blend this perfect, like we're together and we are, you know, yeah, we're having similarities and there are differences, and how to kind of really honor and
mhm,
respect that. And I mean, I was surprised because I was talking almost exclusively about abortion, but people who were having miscarriages were coming
mhm,
and wanting to work with me
mhm.
because of the nuance of language that I was using.
Absolutely. And both of the experiences in different ways are equally stigmatized and siloed away. And so it makes so much sense to me that you, being someone who has some embodiment, somatic language, that there's just so many people who need some semblance of a narrative, a structure of understanding, support,
Mhm.
that it makes so much sense to me that they would gravitate to that language. I would love to hear from you in some of the other ways that the two experiences are similar. Like, what do they bring up in the body? You beautifully named, like, kind of feeling betrayed by the body. Are there other ones that stand out to you that are similar?
Yeah, the betrayal of the body, I would say like the feeling of something's wrong with me
Mm-hmm.
or questioning womanhood.
Mm-hmm.
Um, am I a full woman? Is there something that's broken? Is there something that if I don't fulfill a pregnancy or a birth or motherhood, what will that mean about me and my value and my worth? And so I think, yeah, whatever people's experience, how they feel when they feel like their worth has been diminished, I think that those can be very similar in abortion, miscarriage. Of course, that feels different in everybody's body, but that is such a like, I mean, I think about it for myself when I have hits to my self-esteem or to my self-worth or what my value is, and just like the sinking kind of like punched in the gut sense. And here, I mean, it's really deep in talking about how women have been socialized to kind of like fully blossom when they become a mother. That
Mm-hmm.
that motherhood is the expression
Mm-hmm.
of the feminine, and that means being pregnant and carrying a child and birthing a child and raising that child, and that this I think we all suffer from
Mm-hmm.
to varying degrees, and I would include people who are mothers in that as well. I actually just finished reading Ruby Warrington's book, Women Without Kids,
Yeah, such a good book.
and a term that I hadn't heard or like really took in before, but was oh, I forget exactly how she said it, but like mothering under patriarchy, like patriarchal
Mm.
motherhood, and how this we all are, yeah,
Mhm.
under the thumb of, and it's very painful.
Yeah, I absolutely adored that book. It finally gave voice to a lot of questions and curiosities I've had, and deep skepticism I've had around this narrative of like, once you become a mother, you blossom. I'm like, what does that mean about every inflection moment of your life prior to giving birth? Like, how does that change the weight of things and also sense of identity as well? Like, it almost strips it of the identity of someone. Like, that's the capstone thing. And it's like, what about all these other pieces that are they no
Yeah.
longer valid, no longer important? And really seeing not only my clients, but some of my friends like deeply struggle with that reckoning of identity after. Um, I would love to hear from you. My last question, I could keep asking you questions forever, because I just deeply appreciate your expertise and how you view things. But is there something particular that you would like the listener to know about the relationship of being in the body and pregnancy loss? Something we didn't touch on that maybe is still in your mind that you feel like is quite quintessential for people to know?
Mhm. Sometimes embodiment feels like we have to really target something. And so
Mm,
when thinking about having an abortion, it's like, okay, how do I go straight to the abortion through my body? And I think actually stepping away from being so specific and just going into a practice of whether it's sitting with yourself or moving or dancing or walking or whatever type of movement that someone might be using to get in touch with their body, that you can just enter from a place of curiosity
mm,
and see what comes. That like even if you're not every day presencing your abortion in some practice that you have, it is there. And so I think it can feel overwhelming sometimes to start because it feels like it needs to be really specific or tailored to abortion. And I think that what I've learned from my own experience is that it's going to be there no matter what. And maybe you find something that feels really good, that's going to keep you in contact with your abortion, that's going to help you mature from that experience, which I think is also something that people are deeply yearning for in general, is like a deep sense of maturation. And that motherhood is not the only way to achieve that, but actually, I feel like for myself, I've matured every time I've had an abortion.
mm,
And and sometimes I would feel disappointed because in the last few years I've really committed to dance and movement as a practice.
Mm.
And I was at a dance school in Germany doing a 3-month education. And someone else, they didn't say this, but I was thinking this. I was like, oh, but what about my emotional process? Like, when do I get to share? When do I get to like tell you what I'm feeling and reflecting on when I'm doing this dance or this type of movement? And but someone else spoke to that of like, when are we going to get into the emotional process? And the teacher was like, we're here to dance.
Mm.
Here to teach you how to dance. Of course, there's going to be catharsis. Of course, there's going to be emotions, and you get to just come here and learn this dance. And so, what that did for me, which I realized I desperately needed, was I also get to put the process down.
Yeah.
And I get to just actually go and do this thing that feels really good, and I can carry my story and my experiences along with me, but I get to put the process down.
Hmm.
And I think maybe from being a therapist, from you know wanting being process oriented in my life in
Mm.
general, this was one of the biggest gifts that was given to me, was this woman just saying, kind of like brushing it off almost a
Mm.
little bit, which
Yeah.
felt harsh at the moment, but then I was like, oh, whoa,
Mm.
I get to be with my body, and I don't have to bring up everything all the time. I can just
Yes.
be here. And that has actually given me so much more endurance in my felt sense of when I'm in my body, when something challenging comes up, when grief comes up, um, then I feel like my container is like thicker and kind of like more flexible and can hold it. So yeah, maybe even like letting it go a little
Yeah.
bit.
I love that. We have parallels. I've also deeply appreciated just being able to put the story down.
Yeah.
It's the resonance of the story is always going to be deeply inside my body. I don't need to keep saying it as much as I maybe once did to
Yeah.
validate myself and my younger self's experience.
Mhm.
Thank you so much for your time. I've really enjoyed getting to ask you questions, getting to hear your expertise, and I'm genuinely like so grateful for what you offer and how you show up and the intersection of how you support people. It's so important. And um, yeah, is there anything that you have upcoming that you would like people to know? We'll have all your information in the show notes so people can find you. But if there is something in particular you would like the listener to know that you're offering, this is your moment.
Sure, yeah. I am in the new year going to be offering post-abortion groups again on
Beautiful.
Zoom. And
Yes.
so people can keep an eye out for that. And then I'm also starting groups for couples who are in their
Mm.
planning,
Yay. Yes, this is so important.
in their family planning. Let's just
Yeah,
leave it
yeah.
at that. So yeah, wanting to bring couples together so that,
Yes.
yeah, in a group setting, which I love. I love leading groups, so that people can kind of hear and see each other's experiences and get support in making this really big decision, which of course can touch on everything that we've talked about here today.
Beautiful. And thank you again so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you.
If you found value in this episode, it would mean so much to me for you to share the podcast with friends, a loved one, or on your social platforms. If you have the time, please rate and review the podcast so that this podcast reaches a larger audience and can inspire more and more humans to connect to their bodies too. Thank you for being here and nurturing the relationship you have with your very own